Now for this module, again, let's work with a simple program. And for this attached, you find that starting code, a zip file with an index.html file and an app.js file. The index.html file is relatively lean. We got a button in there and that's it. Get the script import in here. As you can tell by the title, we're going to build a rock, paper, scissors game here, very basic game. Most of the interaction will happen with the help of alerts and prompts and in the console. But we do have that button to start the game, and in the app.js file, which is getting imported here, we basically got an empty file. The only thing I added for you is this access to the button, which allows us to add an event listener. Now speaking of that, we can of course add a function, maybe name it start game, as you learned it with the function keyword, then the name, list of parameters, here I don't need any, and then the function body where you can put your code. And then you can call that function like this, and what this would do, of course, is that if we output game is starting here, just like that, we save that, and we then reload this page, load this page, visit the index.html file, we essentially see the game is starting output here in the console. Clicking the button here doesn't do anything, because, well, we didn't connect this function to the button, we just execute it like this. This would be this so-called direct execution, which I meant. Now, on the other hand, you can also go to the start game button and add an event listener, click listener here, and point at the start game function. Then you don't add parentheses here, instead you just give the add event listener function here the name of the function, and behind the scenes that will do the wire up work and make sure that this function gets called when a click occurs. Now if we do that, then we actually see there is no output right now, but if I click the button, there is. This is this indirect execution. Now the first important thing which I want to highlight here, or which I want to dive in, is this add event listener function actually. This is not a function defined by us. Instead, it's in the end provided by the browser. But we don't call it like this. Instead, we call it on this start game button, which seems to be an object because we use this dot notation. Now you learned that objects can have properties. You can have something like a person object with a name property like this, and then you can always access person.name to, for example, output that, right? So that's the syntax you learned. This is something we know. Now here we also use the dot notation, but what we then do is we don't access a property, we're not logging it or doing some calculation with it. Instead, we execute it as a function. And indeed, functions can be stored inside of objects as well. If we add our person here, and I add a greet property, let's say, like a normal property, thus far nothing special, then instead of just having a value here on the right, something like max or a number or even another object, you can also put a function here. For example, a function greet, and there we could say hello there. This would be a basic function stored in an object. Now, the only special thing here really is that on the right side of our key value pair, so after the colon, we don't have a value which we used thus far to store it in a variable, but instead here we have a function. Now, that's of course a different use of function, because thus far we always created a function standalone. We're not storing this function anywhere, we just create it like this, and this automatically creates this start game thing, which JavaScript registers, which we then later can use by its name. Here, I also do that, but then this seems to be stored in here. And indeed, if we now execute person.greet and we add parentheses here, we can execute this as a normal function. If I save that and reload this page, we see hello there. So indeed, we can store a function in an object, and that is then called a method. It's just a term for it. Just as we name a variable in an object, like name, just as we name this a property, even though in the end it's a bit like storing a value in a variable, just without an equal sign, but that's then called a property. Well, if you store a function in such a property, so in a key in an object, then you call it a method. But a method is nothing else than a function attached to an object, you could say. And add event listener, therefore, is a method on this start game button object. And this is an object generated for us by JavaScript by calling this method up here, the getElementById method, which exists on this document thing. The document thing here, by the way, is a globally available variable in the end, which gives us access to our HTML document. But more on that in a separate module where we dive into how we can interact with the HTML code. That's not the focus of this module. But this in the end is a method which in the end generates or gives us this object which we store in start game button. So an object which represents this button, so to say. And this in turn then has this add event listener method, which we can call to register an event listener. So storing functions in objects is possible. You call them like this, and they're then basically methods. You call them methods if they're stored in objects. So that's our first important thing. I'll comment this out now because we don't need it for the game, but I wanted to mention it that you can have functions in objects and they're then called methods.